For those who see the world not as it is, but as it can be, who seek to make their vision of the future become reality, their mission is our mission. At Lockheed Martin, we never forget who we're working for.
Well, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who's an astrophysicist at University of Hawaii saying, I have a friend of a friend that makes a TV show. I know this is kind of crazy, but he has a few questions and you still live in Los Angeles. Do you want to help them out? But I really think that speaks to the dedication of the writers and the creative process of the writers, that they decided, the head writers and creators of the show decided from the beginning they wanted to get the science right. And so it all goes back to their creative decision.
That's awesome. And how did you get involved?
So I got a phone call too. This was from a friend who was watching the show, and she told me, hey, this is the kind of stuff that you like to think about. Why don't you look at this TV show? So I did. And yeah, it was the sort of stuff I like to think about. So I had written a book a long time ago when I was a medical student. And so I just copied down the address of the television show from the web, and I sent them a copy of my book. And 4 months went by, and finally I got an email that says, hey, we like your book. Why don't you come down to the studio next time you're in Los Angeles? So I immediately went.
Whoa, look at this.
Woo! Thank you.
Okay, organic chemistry. You have to be prepared.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, the basic concept is that Walter White, an organic chemistry high school teacher who is impoverished because of years of teaching high school chemistry, finds out that he's doesn't have long to live, and so he wants to ensure a financial future for his family, and he decides that he's going to turn to a life of crime, synthesize and sell illicit methamphetamines. How I got involved in that is Vince Gilligan, the producer of the show, and his writers didn't have a formal science background. So during the beginning of season 1, they were sort of winging it by reading about science on the web, and he happened to be interviewed by the trade magazine of the American Chemical Society, that's Chemical and Engineering News, and in that interview, he made a plea for assistance from a chemically inclined audience. I responded, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, there's going to be an overwhelming number of volunteers for this. They got back in touch with me, and I started helping, and a couple of years later, I asked the producer, Vince Gilligan, how many volunteers did you get? That magazine goes out to 167,000 people. And he said, 1. So I was the only one. And it's been a great adventure.
So I'm the science consultant for a sitcom called The Big Bang Theory, right, which is a comedy, which, believe it or not, I think at its core, explained to me by the writers, is not about science, believe it or not. The way it was explained to me about the science was, maybe you remember this old black and white sitcom called I Love Lucy? And do you remember Ricky Ricardo? Well, you don't need to know Spanish to know when Ricky Ricardo's angry. And so I think that was the role of the science as explained to me in the show. But
it also begins with an S. That's the Spanish and science.
But we have an awful lot of science in the show, and it's almost like a character hidden behind the scenes.
So I was one of 3 medical technical consultants to a show called House, and thank you.
Yeah.
And by the way, we also had a full-time writer who was a physician, and we had a full-time nurse who was on the set every moment of the filming. So there was a lot of effort to make the science right. And Dr. House is a brilliant but damaged physician who works at a fictional hospital in New Jersey. And every week on the show, there was a villain, and the villain was a disease. And the disease would afflict a patient, and the patient usually had some interesting characteristics that would be good to make a story around. And so every week the show was Dr. House and his team of younger doctors trying to save the life of this patient who was afflicted with some disease. And the model for House, and in fact his namesake, was Sherlock Holmes. And Holmes, of course, you know, from the 1800s, was a famous detective, fictional detective. Those stories were written by a doctor. And Holmes would be able to observe the smallest things about a crime scene or about a witness or the potential perpetrator and be able to make incredible deductions from that and solve the case. And so that's what happened every week on House.
What is it like to get a script, take a look at it from a science perspective and juggle that? How do you get it right and not make it boring?
When I first started, I mean, for decades, we chemists had been dreaming of an opportunity to have a bridge to Hollywood, because whenever incorrect science is presented on TV or in movies, it's like fingernails on the blackboard for us. We would really like to see the science correct, or at least close to correct. So when I saw this opportunity, I thought, hey, this is really great. And yet, there were myths out there that if these shows brought on a science consultant, we would try to make the show into a science documentary, and then it wouldn't be popular. They wouldn't have a hit show anymore. And so right at the very beginning, I understood that I should not do this. I needed not to be heavy-handed. And so I had to have a lot of respect for the writers and the producer. So whenever they would send me pages out of the script, I knew that I knew the science, but they knew how to have a popular TV show, and I didn't. So I looked at how they had read it. I would try to, how they had written it. I tried to change as few words as possible. And in particular, if I needed to change any of the dialogue to make the science correct, I would try to keep the cadence of the dialogue, keep the cadence of the words, and maintain any alliteration or anything like this. And so sometimes I found myself sitting there thinking, now, in order to correct this, I need to change this 3-syllable word that starts with a P. How do I replace this word with one word and still make it correct? And sometimes it's harder than just starting from scratch.
I think, Donna, I think that's so interesting that you would look for the cadence also, so to try to keep the patterns. What gave you that idea?
Well, I very, very strongly believed that they knew how to have a script that would be popular with the audience, and that I didn't. And so I just, I know that sometimes, the cadence and rhythm of what is said, and like I said, alliteration, all of that can be very important with the impact that is had on the audience. And so I just knew to respect it, and I did. And I might say that the science writers and I got along fabulously.
I'll talk a little more about the structure of how things work. So in our season, we'd film over about 9 or 10 months out of the 12-month year, and there'd be 22 episodes more or less. And so every 12 days, we would start filming a new episode. And about 8 days before they start filming, I would get a draft of the script. And it would take me a couple hours to look it over, and I could either have very little work to do, or I could have a lot of work to do, depending on how well the writer understood the process. And so I would correct errors wherever I found errors. I would sometimes suggest different words, and only very rarely would I have to step in with something big. And the problem is, when you've only got 8 days till you start filming, and the writer has been working on this story for 4 months, it's like a very delicately built machine. You can't go in and start tearing parts of it out, because it has cascade effects, and before you know it, you've eviscerated the script. And with only 8 days, they can't fix it. So you have to balance between how much chaos do I want to cause versus how much good can I do. And most of the time, that was not a hard decision. The fixes were not big.
Can you give an example like Donna did, where you're looking at cadence or something, or a time when it was tough to find that balance?
Sure. There was one situation where I got this script and I looked at it, and if you're in an hour show like ours, the big cliffhanger is at 30 minutes past the hour. So it's after Act 2. And so, and then you break to a commercial. And so that's where you want the most dramatic thing. And right in this most dramatic thing, there was a terrible error. This was about a young girl who had a bleeding disorder, and I knew what the final diagnosis was going to be, and I said, there's no way. The things you need to make this little girl bleed, they just can't happen in real life. And it was impossible to fix. So I told the writers, we're just going to have to take our lumps because otherwise it'll be chaos. So we took our lumps and nobody noticed it, which was kind of cool. And then 2 years later, I'm just reading a medical journal one day, and it happened to be on this particular problem, and I get to this sentence, and by gosh, it says that physiology could have happened. And this was news to me, so I called up the writer and I said, hey, did you know about this? And I'm not going to tell you what she said. So, but it worked out okay in the end.
It's nice when science works out like that.
That's right.
David, how about you?
So we had a problem like that
Yeah,
once,
yeah.
where I received a script and it was all put together, and they had Sheldon was working with Leonard's mother, Beverly, and they were writing a paper together, and he's a physicist, a quantum physicist, she's a psychiatrist, and they were working on something called quantum brain dynamic theory, about the only overlap, a boo.
Yeah.
Most people don't think very highly of this. It's a somewhat ungrounded science on the origin of consciousness. But the whole script depended on it. And what else would you have the two of them work on? So I wrote back to the writers and I said, I know you've built this in, you can't get around it, but at least I should tell you. So I get back another version of the script a day or so later, and they're working on disproving quantum brain dynamic theory.
That's good.
Well, so I'd jump in there and say, that's, I think, the great thing about working with these writers. They're really smart people, and that's a tremendously enjoyable part of this kind of job. And the second is an experience like David's, where I'd say, this is a big problem. We're a little more relaxed circumstances here, not the 8 days before. I go, you're going to easily write yourself into a corner here. And they go, no, that problem is really good because we can flip it around and we can make it a dramatic cornerstone of the episode. So they're really great at taking hardship and turning it into an opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's really super. Now, on your show, you mentioned that there were some others who had expertise there. Is that true for you guys too? Are there some of the writers?
Yes.
Yeah.
For example, if you watch an episode of Breaking Bad, at the end in the credits, you'll see that they acknowledge the assistance of the DEA. So a lot of people do not realize that Vince used the DEA continually. There were multiple reasons for that. One was so that they would not have a show that was a cookbook to allow people to make illicit methamphetamine. So, and the other reason was that the DEA, they needed to know what the equipment looked like and what the process looked like for making illegal meth in the field. And I don't know that. I've never made illegal meth. That's not something that we chemistry professors go home and do at night or on the weekends.
Believe it or not. Right?
Yeah, really. And so, but the DEA does know exactly what this equipment looks like and what the procedures look like, and so they were able to advise them on this. And so a lot of people don't realize that they use the DEA, but they did. There was multiple people inside the DEA.
And how about you? Do you have other physicists hanging around too among the screenwriting cadre?
Well, none of the writers were physicists, but they know a lot of science. I think part of the job of a writer, especially a comedy writer, I'm told, is to know about everything.
Yeah.
So, like John was saying, these are really smart people.
Yes.
And we do have a lot of expertise, though. One of the co-creators, Bill Prady, was a software engineer. And so a lot of the ideas of the people, the characters, came from that experience. You may have, Eric Kaplan, who's another writer on the show, was a graduate student in philosophy. And there's you may remember hearing about Munchausen's trilemma and things like that. So, but the show is smart not just because of its science. There's philosophy, there's history, there's quite a lot in that show that's just really smart. And I learn something often reading the scripts.
I have to say, I do also when I'm watching the shows. You know, in Big Bang Theory, you have a neuroscientist. You mentioned psychiatrist, physical, you know, particle physicist, and you know, and also engineer, right? So there's quite a variety to play off of.
I don't know any biology. My last biology I took was in 9th grade. So some of the junior high students here know more biology than I do. Luckily, there's a person who has my back. Those of you that know Amy on the show, the actress that plays her is named Mayim Bialik, and she has a PhD in neuroscience from UCLA. So we won't get any neuroscience errors past the actors.
Yeah. What's the hardest part of the job? We talked about some of the balancing, and what's the most fun? Can you think of some things that I'm sure everybody here is really curious about that?
Well, for me, I didn't really find anything hard. I guess the only thing that might have been difficult was that I realized that they would need really fast turnaround. They can't sit around and wait on the set and tell all the actors and everybody, now just sit down. We have to wait on the science advisor to tell us something. You know, so they have time issues, and so they need an answer as quickly as possible. But I mean, I knew that immediately, so I always tried to get the answer back to them within 24 hours. Something that was that I really enjoyed, I enjoyed exploring a different community. I enjoyed that straight off from the very beginning. But at the very end, I realized that all along Vince Gilligan had been making the science spectacular, so spectacular that sometimes it would outshine the actors. And it was as if he made it a separate character, and I asked him if that was what he intended, and he said yes. I think of one in particular in which Walt and Jesse are in the super lab. Walt is talking to Gus, and Walt is saying things like, without us, you have nothing. Without us, you have an $8 million hole in the ground. You need us to be able to synthesize your product for your income, for your for your distribution. And I thought that that was a really good parallel to informing the public of all the benefits that science and therefore scientists bring to them. And so in that way, it's informing the public of how important science is to them. For example, just another 15 seconds. I'm not certain that when men and women get up in the morning and put on their cologne, they look in the mirror and they say, wow, this smells great. I really appreciate the wonderful science and the scientists that brought this to me. I don't know that they think about it that way, you know, but it would be really nice if they did, and just think a lot about the positive things that science brings all of us every day.
Well, my heart would sink whenever the patient was a child, because my pediatrics was probably as long ago as David's biology. So, you know, children's diseases are hard. And, you know, I remember one time the writer says to me, the patient's a child, and I want the patient to die at the end. And moreover, because, you know, sometimes it happens. And he said, more than that, I want the condition to be absolutely untreatable. Not a thing you can do for it. So I came up with one. It was a pretty good one, pretty good answer. And then like 5 days before filming starts, he calls up and he says, we want the child to live. And I said, but, and he goes, I know. So, you know, whenever you have a diagnostic situation, you make a rank order of what the diseases are most probable, you know, number 1, number 2, number 3. So he said, okay, we'll just switch number 2 to number 1. We'll leave everything the way it is, and we'll just say it's number 2. So we did that because number 2 was treatable. And the interesting thing is that when our show was on, there was one doctor who used to blog about our show, and he'd analyze every episode. So for this episode, his analysis was, okay, yeah, the signs and the symptoms, they all match, but they really match this fatal, incurable disease more than the one that they actually diagnosed.
That was good.
Did you respond to that blog?
No, I never did.
But now you all know, right?
So I, in our case, it's a lot like what Donna was saying. When they need something, they need it yesterday. If they call on the phone, you have to answer. Luckily, the phone has never gone off when I've been lecturing, or that would be a problem. So they work on a very different time schedule. But once was about the shortest ever because we tape in front of a live studio audience, like theater. Some people think our show has a laugh track, but that laughter is a real group about this size that's watching the show. And Leonard dropped a bottle down the elevator shaft from the 4th floor, and the crash of the bottle was too soon. And the executive producer turned to me and said, David, how long does it take for a bottle to fall 4 stories? And everybody was waiting, and taping had stopped until I could do 1/2 GT squared in my head.
32 feet per second per second. Yeah. So I promised you all you'd get a chance to, you can see I could go on all day, but I promised you all you'd get a chance to ask a couple of questions too.
I teach physics to artists. I teach up at Baltimore School for the Arts. These include actors.
Nice.
So particularly in physics, what would you have to say to the actors, or do you ever interact with them, and what could you pass on to them?
So I do interact with the actors, and they are the nicest people ever. What's interesting is I almost never have to talk to them about pronunciation and they don't get right there's more to it than the pronunciation. There's something about owning the line of dialogue and the rhythm which either sounds right or sounds wrong. And I know the actors, they go and they Wikipedia the little dialogue as much as they can. Now they're not going to learn everything, but they understand enough to understand the emotional truth of what they're saying, and it just works. And and I remember asking one of the executive producers, how do the actors get this right? And he just said, that's what they're good at. They're good at playing make-believe. But it's really nice. So I'm not a writer, and in fact, I also give them choices because of this thing that everyone else was saying. There's a rhythm. I don't know if they want something long or something short, but occasionally they'll say a few words that I chose. And that's such a weird feeling because you know how much it costs and how many people are watching it. And they're like, don't listen to me about what words. There must be some expert you could ask. So it's really nice when you see your own few words, 2 or 3 words, go out over the airwaves.
Or drawings.
Do you tell people those were my words? Those 3 words?
All 3 of your shows, which I've watched, relate to characters with disabilities. In Big Bang Theory, there's a character that's canonically on the autism spectrum. In House, there's characters with disabilities very often. Dr. House himself could socially identify as a person with disability. Almost all of the characters in Breaking Bad do have a disability of a sort. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the social implications of being the brains behind these characters and finally giving intelligence to disabled people on TV when they're so often told that they don't have that? And I also need to specifically thank you, Dr. Sotos, for putting my illness on TV for the first time. Postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome was never in the media. And when I saw it on House, that was kind of an outstanding moment. And the entire community of people with this illness, thank you a lot.
Well, so let me correct you on something. I didn't give any kind of life to these characters at all. The writers, and in our case, the creator of the show, David Shore, is the guy who invented the character, who put the physical disability in with the leg, and he didn't get that from Sherlock Holmes. He got the drug addiction from Sherlock Holmes, but not the cane and the leg disability. So really, I take no credit for what makes these people interesting. In your case of POTS, I can't take credit for that particular one either. That must have been one of the other folks. But for some of the conditions of the week, I had a friend in college who had a medical problem, and I got that one on the show, and things like that. So thanks for your comments, though, anyway.
Well, my answer to that question is these producers and writers are taking science to the public. they're pioneering this. It's wonderful of them, and so they're pioneering also taking people with disabilities and the information about that to the public, and so it just shows that pioneers in one area are often pioneers in other areas as well, and I think it's terrific.
I should just clarify that Sheldon they've never said Sheldon has any condition. Some people, if people want to own him and imagine he has something, I think that's fine, but he's never been diagnosed. In fact, on the show, he says his mother had him tested. So.
House question. So I mean, part of House is he has to be wrong 3 times an episode.
It might be 4.
Or more, yeah. So I was wondering how hard it was to be realistically wrong before he gets it right.
Well, yeah, that's kind of insightful because one of the hardest things was, the character shows up, he has 1 or 2 symptoms, and they construct a list of possibilities. And then 15 minutes pass, and they construct another list of possibilities after some more symptoms have showed up. So in real life, as you get more and more symptoms layered on, you can focus in, and your list of possibilities gets narrower. But the demand was, even though he was wrong a couple times, you needed to keep expanding the list. So that was a little difficult in some situations. You'd have to save one of the possibilities early so you could use it later.
Okay, on House and on Big Bang Theory, it's very important to get all of the science correct. But my question is for Donna, where you actually can't get the science too correct. So how do you deal with that? And as a chemistry teacher, can you make meth as well as Walter White?
Well, believe it or not, I've been asked that before. We don't, the science that you see is correct. It's just not complete. Some things are left out intentionally, and I'm glad that happened. One part of your question is, can I make meth? I've synthesized things that are a lot more difficult than that. I have never made meth, but I have 100% confidence that if I wanted to, I could. It's not something I'm interested in. I don't have that inclination. I think that it's wonderful that this has been put on TV. One thing that I do often say, though, is that as far as getting the science completely correct and getting it 100% accurate, we have to allow the producers and the writers the flexibility for artistic creativity. We don't want to turn this into a science documentary. That's not the goal. The goal is to have a hit show. They have to have a hit show that will be popular with the public. And so that means that they have to have a little bit of wiggle room. So for example, I'll tell you one thing that happened. On one of my set visits, Vince came up to me and said, "What do you think about making the meth blue?" And I said, "Don't do it." And he said, but is there really a reason not to? And I said, yeah. I said, it's not going to be blue. And he said, but if you get it really, really pure, isn't there some reason that it could be blue? And I said, no, not really. Don't do that. But he did it anyway, And I defend his right to do this because he's an artist. It's not a science documentary. He needed to give a trademark to Walt to make the show more interesting. And the goal was to have a hit show that would be interesting to the public, get the science out to the public, not have another science documentary. So I have no problems with it.
I have one. I'm going to throw one question out just because I think there are a lot of young people in the audience. How'd you pick the field you picked that you're in now? When you're not screenwriting, what made you pick chemistry, to be a doctor, to be a physicist?
Well, my father and grandfather were both MDs. In a small town, my father was the only doctor in that town. So I originally started out wanting to be a doctor. I was going to be an MD and take over the family practice the same way my father had taken over his father's practice. So I went away to the university and I started taking all the courses that I needed to have to be a pre-med student. And then I think somewhere along my junior year, I was going to declare that I was a pre-med. Back then, you didn't declare pre-med day one on campus as a freshman. You waited until you had taken a lot of the courses. I went home and I told my father, I mentioned it to him, and he said, no, you don't want to be a doctor. And I said, well, yeah, why not? And he said, you're around sick people all the time. He said, every day in your office, all day, you listen to people complain about how bad they feel. You start to think everybody's a hypochondriac. And he said, you want to be around people who are happy and healthy, and you want lifelong learning. You want to have complete and total autonomy, be able to take a vacation when you want. And I started thinking, that's the life of a professor. So as a junior, I decided I wanted to be a professor and have the total autonomy to choose exactly what I wanted to do in my research. And at that time, I'd had so many chemistry courses, I decided, the shortest way to a BS is just have it be chemistry. I went to graduate school, and that's where I discovered I loved organic chemistry. So I became a professor of organic chemistry. And I do love it. I am still happy to this day that I selected that profession. I'm really delighted. I would strongly recommend that other kids do it.
Well, if you grew up at the same time I did in the United States, you wanted to be an astronaut. And that's absolutely what I wanted to do. But at some point, you calculate the odds in your head, and you say, I better have a backup plan.
Yeah.
So in high school, I had a great course in biology. And so I decided to be a pre-med at that point, and went to college and majored in chemistry. And, but still stuck with the astronaut thing as sort of a side hobby. And once you sort of get in the pipeline, one thing just happens after another, and eventually I ended up as a cardiologist. The astronaut thing almost worked out, but I'm too colorblind.
Oh.
And so I went as far as my genetic potential allows me to go.
Well, I think I might have been on track for becoming a chemist originally, because I used to like to blow things up. We used to make nitrogen triiodide, which would explode on contact.
Nice.
And we made a distillery when I was a kid. But the
gosh.
copper oxidized and it came out green. But then I took a physics class and I just really liked it. And I just put one foot in front of the other and just liked that. So I just kept going with that. And so I don't ever think I had a grand plan. I just, from year to year, did what I liked the most. And that just led me down the trail of physics.
I was wondering if I could have a little bit more detail from you two about how you were selected and recruited to be the scientists for these shows.
When I was a medical student, just learning about the human body, I got very interested in one question, which is a standard question when you get older, your doctor might ask you, which is how many pillows do you sleep with at night? And it turns out I can tell how well your heart works based on how many pillows you sleep with at night, which is a pretty... I mean, every doctor in this audience will go, yeah, I know that. But it's really a pretty amazing thing to learn for the first time. And so I got interested in this idea of how I can look at you and look at your ears and tell that your back hurts. Or, I can shake your hand and tell you how you're going to die, that sort of thing. And
You're not shaking my hand.
So what's the answer? I mean, how many pillows?
Yeah. I'm dying
So
about pillows.
it comes down to physics, and that is if you lay flat and your heart is inefficient, the fluid builds up in your chest cavity to the point your lungs can't exchange oxygen. And you get short of breath and you wake up at night. And you then put another pillow in and you angle yourself up, and now that fluid is down at the bottom and you have more lung area exposed to exchange the oxygen. So it's pretty straightforward once you understand the magic. So I'll get back to your question. So in medical school, I started writing a book, and I would just collect all these magical things. And the pillow thing is not magic to a medical audience, but there are a lot of things like the ears and back pain that are magic. And so I had this book published a long time ago, and it's about all this weird stuff in medicine. And if you ever watched House, there's a lot of weird stuff on that show. We make the diagnosis because a guy's fingers don't turn pruny when he takes a shower. And so when I sent my book down to those folks, they saw all this kind of cool stuff in there, and they said, hey, we should try and get that guy on board. And so that's how it happened.
So, one more quick question from me before we wrap up. There are a lot of young people in the audience. If you had to go back to your 8-year-old self and give yourself a piece of advice, because they're all thinking now, what are they going to do? What would you say?
I'll say do science with your friends. Pick good friends to do science with, work with someone, talk about the concepts a lot. It's not something to do, people might think of science as this sort of lonely endeavor, but it really works better if you have someone to talk to about it.
So I could be flip and say I would recommend to my 8-year-old self to memorize all the color vision tests. But I'm going to play off something David just said, which is hang around smart people. Try to pick smart people as your friends, and they'll uplift you and drag you along. And subscribe to Scientific American.
Yeah.
Well, 3 things that I've done whenever I select my research projects or my projects such as advising Breaking Bad. One is shoot for the moon. You might hit Mount Everest. You want to always be reaching as high as you can. 2, if you've really researched and thought out your goal properly, don't let other people dissuade you. Be persistent and stick with it. Even if people tell you you can't, if you've really thought about it and you've got a good plan, go right ahead. And the third one is be ready for that opportunity. And when you see it come up, just like when I saw the article in Chemical and Engineering News and I saw Vince reaching out, be ready to grab it and go for it because it might not come along again.